We're going to start looking at the basidiomycetes by looking at the most rudimentary group of basidiomycetes that are there. These are ones that really don't have a well-defined body. They may be voluminous or they may have three-dimensionality. This picture over here shows you corn smut. The basidiomycete actually moves down the pollen tube into the developing corn grain and takes over the machinery on the inside of the corn grain, so that the corn kernel, instead of looking like a regular kernel, gets blown up into something monstrous and grotesque like this we see on the outside. This is made up of many different kernels. The inside is filled with mycelium that eventually turns into spores. The spores are what we call teleospores. What they do is when they germinate, instead of producing an extensive mycelium system to it, they actually produce a basidium. On the outside of the basidium, you get the production of spores. These are unique because this particular one produces a lot of spores off of the same basidium. Instead of just having 4, it is constantly producing spores when it germinates. The other type we get in this is associated with this. This is bunt of wheat. It is done by a fungus called Talichiacaris. Talichiacaris as well produces a teleospore. The teleospore germinates to produce a basidium, and on top of the basidium up here, it also produces basidiospores. These can replicate in a certain way by asexual reproduction. This is unique and different from a lot of other things. We don't have any real body to this. It's more of a mycelium that breaks down and forms these little spores. The next group we're going to look at is probably the most complex group we have, which are called the rusts. These are very important plant pathogens. There are 5 stages to them, and we have to look at all of them. The first stage is called a pycnium. It looks like a little flask. It is subepidermal on leaves. The top part of it has what are called receptive hyphae. It also produces what we call spermatia. The receptive hyphae correspond to the female gametes. The spermatia refer to the male gametes. When you see this, it actually looks like a little flask right below the dermal layer of the tissue. The spermatia fertilize the receptive hyphae, then you will get a dikaryotic hyphae moving downwards, forming what we call the acium. The acium is interesting because the spores in it are what we call catenulate or in chains. This is virtually the only spore you're going to find like this in the fungal kingdom. These produce these large structures that are underneath of the leaf tissue. Sometimes they can actually be next to the pycnium up on top. If you look at these in mass, they can look like that. Again, these vary depending on which species we have. Over here, it shows the relationship of the pycnium to the acium on the underside. One's on one side of the leaf, the other one's on the other. In the center here, we have what we call the Iridium. These are produced when the aciospores cause infection of a plant, and it will start out producing a Iridium. You can see that these are single-celled spores. It is produced subdermally on the plant. They rupture up and then they get a lot of spores being produced from it. This is what one looks like in cross section. This is what one looks like in whole section from the top. Eventually, in the life cycle of this, at some time it will produce what is called a telium. Telium looks like this. It is very similar to the Iridium, but in some species you get the production of 2 cells in this particular material. As you get these 2 cells in here, it shows you a big difference between these. These do not blow anywhere. They do not get transmitted anywhere. They stay wherever they are produced. In the spring, after they overwinter, these teleospores will produce basidia on top of them. The basidia will produce basidiospores. That's what this shows. It shows you the basidium growing out of the teleospore, and then you can see the basidium up on top of it where the new spores are going to be produced. These would blow around, and when these infect the plant, you would get the formation of the pycnium. These are labeled different numbers. The acium is labeled a lowercase I, or 1. The Iridium is a 2, the telium is a 3, and the teleospore is a 4. This goes back to when they first discovered these. They were looking at them. They knew there was an interrelationship between these, but they had not made the connection with the pycnium up on top, which only came around later. Because of that, the pycnium has a label of a 0. There are many different ways that these can be seen on plants. This is a rust of pine needles. You can see the accumulation of all this material coming out, which is basically spores for this particular rust fungus. This is a rust on mallow. This is a type of weed. It's a rather severe rust on it. You can see the major distortion that you're getting out of these. This is a rust on another plant, and basically what these are the pycnia on the upper side of the plant. On the lower side of the plant, you would then find the ascia. This is Iridospores on the underside of oxalis. If you look at them very closely, you can see all of this powdery mass underneath there. This is one that's called Gymnosporangium juniperi virginiana, which is a very unique one. We call it cedar apple rust. This is the teleoform of it. This is on a cedar tree. This thing is about golf ball size. The structure that it produces underneath of it is also very interesting because it helps the fungus to overwinter. This is ascia being formed on crabapple in the springtime. We can see things that look like this. This is fusiform rust on pine. You can see the size gall that this is actually producing on the wood. It's a very devastating disease. This is another one on a pine. This is a rather massive limb that has been degraded due to fusiform rust. When we look at the rusts all told, they are part of the basic kinds of basidiomycetes. They are basidiomycetes because they produce the basidium. However, they are different because they really don't have a well-developed thallus. We had the smuts and the rust that we saw in this part.